coming in. Dog's gonna bite. You gotta come out. Trooper Smith's right here, Sergeant Smith. He's in the lit garage. He's lit up for lighting. As he's looking in that kitchen, the defendant standing in the dark comes forward. The defendant came forward with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun. It's a pump action. And by the time Sergeant Smith saw him, he yells, "Gun! Gun!" He's backing out. And then you hear, bang! That first shot went through Sergeant Smith. He had his vest on. But right here is where I have the strap. Went right underneath that, ripped through his collarbone, broke ribs, ripped through his lungs, and he fell down. He fell on that garage floor, and Trooper Lively, who's there trying to provide backup for him, wants to get him out of there. And then as he's laying on the ground, you hear another bang. The defendant shot him again with a slug through his leg, went through his back calf, thigh area came out the front end. Trooper Lively drags him out of the way. Trooper Barnes and Capel, they're back on the steps. They're not even up the steps. Deputy Capel will say he got to the point when he heard those gunshots. Sergeant Smith was able to, after the gunshot, get off before he fell 2 rounds on his gun. But he was going to actually take his dog and throw him in the kitchen, the canine, to bite the defendant. But when he saw the defendant with the barrel coming around the kitchen, he had to back up. Him and Trooper Barnes went back down to the basement. Deputy Capel will tell you he did fire his pistol after those shots, those 4 shots up front, 2 by the defendant and 2 that Trooper Smith got off. He fired his gun twice and ended up going through the wall. And then he saw the kitchen door close. But now Deputy Barnes and Trooper Barnes and Deputy Capel, who now Deputy Capel is a trooper, but they will tell you they were both in the basement. They couldn't get out. They didn't feel safe going up, and they had to stay down there. They were able to make communication with their text messages on their phone. Trooper Lively ended up getting Sergeant Smith out through the north addition, out this way. They were able to get him. There's a church parking lot real close by. That's where the ambulance was, but they were not able to save Sergeant Smith. The ambulance will show. He died of that gunshot wound to the chest. So now they have the defendant in the kitchen, or at least in the main floor of the house. They call another tactical team, and they're bringing in what they call the Bearcat. You're going to hear the Bearcat. It's an armored vehicle. So they have to drive the armored vehicle up from Des Moines, so it takes some time. Troopers are arriving. They have the house surrounded. And they also bring in a negotiator. You can hear from him, Tom Williams. He's negotiating when he gets there with the defendant by phone, trying to get the defendant to come out. He'll tell you several times the defendant would hang up, would answer, would hang up. They'd talk. And the gist of it was the negotiators asking the defendant to come out with your hands up. Nothing in your hands, just come out with your hands up. Never did. So finally, they decided the negotiator's going to go in the Bearcat with the other troopers in the Bearcat. And the Bearcat's going to drive up to the front of the house. They have what they call as a ramrod on the end of this Bearcat. And the purpose of that is to knock down things. So they put it by the window, and it started hitting by the kitchen window, the rattle. And then the negotiator will tell you, the defendant said, okay. He started to come out. At the front door here, the negotiator will say, he saw the defendant, but he was turned, he couldn't see his hands. And then the Bearcat was right over here, hitting the wall, and the defendant went back in, shut the door. When the defendant went back in and shut the door, Chas Ocean was the driver of that Bearcat. So he put it in reverse, backed it up. As he's putting it in reverse, where that pole was in the house, the defendant fired another 12-gauge slug, hitting the windshield, the lower windshield, right where Chas Ocean was. The defendant fired a second shot from that 12-gauge shotgun. At that point, the tactical team did return fire. and they did hit the defendant. They did knock down the wall, and they were able to go in and get Trooper Barnes, Deputy Capel, and the dog out. And then they took the defendant into custody. The evidence in this case will show that the defendant shot Sergeant Smith, that Sergeant Smith died as a result of being shot in the chest. The evidence will show the defendant acted with malice aforethought. The evidence will show the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with specific intent to kill Sergeant Smith. The evidence will also show when he shot at the Bearcat, he was trying to kill the driver of the Bearcat, Chas Ocean. The evidence will show that he attacked Cody Niehaus, even though he's a reserve officer, he's a peace officer. And at the close of the case, the state will ask you to find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, attempt to commit murder, and assault on a peace officer. Thank you.
Mr. Hoppiger, the defense will be making an opening at this time.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, please proceed.
Thank you. May it please the court? Counsel. Morning again. The reality is, all deaths are tragic. There's nothing good about it. But not every act that leads to the death of another person is murder, and that's why we're here. The opening statement is different than arguments. The judge will explain what the arguments are, but the idea is to sort of foreshadow and give the idea of what the evidence is that will come in, and Mr. Hamlin has done so from the state's point of view. But not only is it important about what the evidence will show, it's important what the evidence won't show. There's no question but that it started with the event with Officer Niehaus, that there was an assault of Officer Niehaus out there that led to Mr. Lang ultimately ending up in his house. Locked doors, okay, because they have these barricades, but there's evidence that he was locked in his house. He wasn't communicating with law enforcement. So what happens then is a significant lapse of time. An officer at the room will get there, and Mr. Frost, Mr. Hammer points out, when they're knocking on the doors, they're saying, come out. They're knocking on the doors saying, come out, let's talk. They're not knocking on the door and announcing their intentions. They're just yelling at him to come out. And the impression that's hard to give you in this short period of time is just how much longer the elapse of time that took place before, for some reason, ultimately law enforcement decided to go into his house. And why then? Law enforcement, the facts will show, surround his house. In lots of different jurisdictions. It's not just the Grundy County Police. It's not just the Iowa State Troopers. It's not just the Hardin County Police. It's not just the Grundy County Sheriff's Office. There are four different, at least, jurisdictions. People dressed in full gear. Most of them carrying long guns, rifles, or at least handguns. All armed to the teeth and surrounding the house of this man, yelling at him to come out. During that time, this long lapse of time, you'll see they took a lot of photos. Photos of the house. There are windows all over the place. There's a window in that garage door. During that entire time when they're surrounding this house, in that long wait, a couple hours, not a shot comes out the window. There's no attempt to harm a peace officer during that 2-hour period. There's no shots going through doors. There's no shots going through walls. For those of you that have any familiarity with firearms, the shotgun can go through a wall. It can certainly go through a non-solid door. None of that was happening. So there's no attempt on Mr. Lang's part during this time. The evidence will show there's absolutely no interaction with law enforcement during that time. The first time, another four shots that Mr. Lang fired. The first two happened when that kitchen door was open and Sergeant Smith was there with his long gun pointed into the kitchen. Those are the only two shots. The facts will show that Mr. Lang didn't follow up the shots. He didn't shoot through that door when Officer Capel was out there with the dog barking commands. He didn't shoot through a wall to try to get them to back up. It was only until that kitchen door cracked open and a gun was visible to Mr. Lang. 2 shots, no more. The evidence will show too, especially from the photos, that certainly Mr. Lang had the capability to fire more. It's not like he ran out of ammunition, he got the shells and all that. 2 shots, nothing more. Again, long lapse of time. Law enforcement's regrouping, we're trying to negotiate. Long lapse of time. And then the only other 2 shots that Mr. Lang shoots are the ones of that armored vehicle. And you'll see the photos of this. The only time that Mr. Lang fires again is when that armored vehicle starts to rip the front off of his house. The reaction was to fire at that vehicle. That's what the facts would show. That's what happened. It was senseless. It didn't need to happen. But it's not murder. And ultimately, when Mr. Hammond is talking about these concepts of premeditation and malice aforethought and things like that, you will be hunting for the why. And when you understand that lapse of time in the context of the very few shootings that Mr. Lang was responsible for, we'll come back to you and ask for a much different verdict than Mr. Hammond is suggesting. That he's not guilty of first-degree murder. There was no attempt to kill anybody in that armored vehicle. And the assault on Mr. Niehaus was less serious than his portrayal. Those are the verdicts we'll be looking for. I thank you for your time.
Okay, we're going to take our lunch recess at this time. Counsel, do you know what time your first witness is under subpoena? Would you prefer to start at 1:30 or 1?
Our witness will be ready at 1 year.
Is that your preference?
Yes.
All right, and defense concur?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll need you back here, ready to go at 1 o'clock, again, in your jury room. I'll have you heed the admonition. One of the things I did not mention during the admonition is oftentimes you're going to find yourself waiting, okay? I'll tell you a specific time, and to be blunt, it's my best guess. That's all it is. We'll take issues up outside your presence, and I have no idea, frankly, how long either side is going to necessarily argue that particular issue. I don't know when I excuse you during that break whether I'm going to know the answer off the top of my head or whether I'm going to require some research. And so as I excuse you to take that issue up, I'm giving you my best estimate. Every jury trial we have in the first district, we give the jury, when they're done, a kind of an exit questionnaire, a poll about their situation. In Waterloo in particular, we don't have parking like you have here. That's their chief complaint always, which I have no control over. And the second one is they don't feel like they have a very useful, their time was used appropriately. Ward Dyer is a pretty good example of that, as folks sat around yesterday feeling like, boy, this took a long time. Breaks in particular are also an issue. So I try to just give you a heads up at the front end of it rather than at the tail end. That there will be times where you're left waiting. I'll tell you to be here at 1, and you may not get brought into the courtroom until 1:30. Issues come up. We have to deal with those issues outside your presence. I have to make rulings on those. Other times, I may tell you, we're going to need a 15-minute recess, and you might catch me walking in the hallway, and it took us 5. But I've told you 15, and folks have gone to do their thing during that 15 minutes. We're not going to bring you in earlier. So I'll apologize in advance for me, because I'm the one who makes that call, but also the parties as far as those delays. They will happen, and just getting you accustomed to that in advance. Sometimes we'll take an hour and a half lunch. You need to recognize that when we take breaks, as I mentioned, the mid-morning break, the mid-afternoon break, even a lunch break, we're going to deal with things outside your presence sometimes during those breaks as well. My reporter absolutely needs a physical break. We need a mental break. Sometimes we need to use the restroom as well. And so we're going to work through a lot of those breaks, but we also need to actually have the time for us to take a break. And so consequently, you may look at it And from your focus and viewpoint, I think it's an excessive break. I'm just giving you a heads up now that in kind of a perspective of ours, that we're working a lot of times during those breaks, and so it might seem longer, but there's things being done. Okay? So with that, you folks are going to take your first lunch break as jurors. Again, caution you can't even talk amongst yourselves about this case. If you haven't done so already, you're probably going to need to be checking in with work, telling them, I got picked, so I won't be returning to work today or anytime in the near rest of this week future. Inevitably, you know that invites a response from them. Don't allow it. And if you go home and you have lunch with somebody else other than folks in your group, don't talk about this case. If they persist, don't allow it. Okay? So, all rise for the jury.